Police examined this address more than once, yet nothing at first glance appeared out of place. On an ordinary weekday morning, the streets of South London followed a familiar rhythm. Buses stopped at their usual points, shop shutters lifted slowly. Residents stepped out for work, school, or errands, moving through routines shaped by habit rather than thought. From the outside, this neighborhood gave no reason to pause. Rows of terraced houses stood quietly, each similar to the next, blending into a landscape defined by predictability. One of those properties was unremarkable in every visible way. Its exterior showed no sign of neglect or excess. The windows were clean, the door was well maintained, parcels were delivered and collected like anywhere else. Neighbors, when later asked, would describe nothing unusual. People came and went, but never in a way that drew attention. The address appeared to belong exactly where it was. Daily life continued without interruption. Children passed by on their way to school. Delivery vans stopped briefly, then moved on. Evenings brought parked cars and drawn curtains. If there were conversations happening behind those walls, they stayed private, absorbed into the background noise of the city. No complaints were filed, no emergency calls were logged. The property existed, as so many do, without incident. And yet, records would later show that authorities had noted this address more than once, not because of a specific allegation and not because of a single alarming event, but because it appeared in places it did not fully belong. At the time, those references seemed minor, administrative even, easily explained, easily set aside. But questions, once raised, rarely disappear entirely. Elsewhere in the UK, similar routines were unfolding. In Leicester, Birmingham, and parts of Essex, mornings followed the same steady pattern. Different streets, different communities, but the same sense of normality. People focused on work, family, and daily responsibilities. There was nothing linking these places in the public imagination, no visible thread connecting one city to another. Behind the scenes, however, information moves differently. It does not rely on appearances. It accumulates quietly through reports, databases, and routine exchanges between institutions. A name appears more than once. A phone number connects locations that rarely intersect. A travel record aligns with a timeline in an unexpected way. On their own, such details carry little weight. Together, they begin to suggest questions. At this early stage, no conclusions were drawn. Authorities stated later that the initial observations were treated with caution. Modern investigations are designed to avoid assumptions. Patterns must be tested, not imagined. Every alternative explanation must be considered. Coincidence, after all, is common in a country of millions. Still, the questions remained. Why did certain addresses appear in unrelated administrative records? Why did routine checks involve the same individuals across different regions? Why did information originating outside the UK occasionally intersect with domestic systems in quiet but noticeable ways? None of this was visible to the people living their daily lives. From the outside, nothing had changed. The same streets, the same routines, the same sense of ordinary continuity. If there was something forming beneath the surface, it did not disturb the calm above it. In offices far removed from these neighborhoods, analysts reviewed information as part of their regular duties. This was not unusual work. Every day, data is examined to ensure compliance with immigration rules, border controls, and international agreements. Most reviews lead nowhere. Files are closed, notes are archived, attention moves on. But some files resist closure. They do not contain errors, yet they feel incomplete. Not wrong, but not fully explained. In this case, several small inconsistencies began to cluster around the same general time frame. Travel movements that aligned closely, contact details reused in ways that were technically permissible but uncommon, references to individuals already known to authorities in other jurisdictions, though for reasons that were not yet clear. No accusations were made, no labels applied. At this point, the process was observational, not adversarial. The role of authorities was simply to understand whether these overlaps mattered or whether they would dissolve under closer inspection. The context extended beyond the UK. Records indicated that partner agencies in Europe were conducting their own reviews. Belgium, in particular, was monitoring activity connected to cross-border movement. This was part of standard international cooperation, a routine exchange of information designed to ensure legal consistency between countries. Most such exchanges are procedural and uneventful. Yet even here, familiar details surfaced again. Names, locations, or contact points that echoed information already present in UK systems. Not enough to alarm, but enough to note. The kind of repetition that invites a pause, if only to confirm accuracy. Back in the neighborhoods where all of this quietly converged, nothing changed. People continued to pass the same houses, shops closed at the same time each evening. Life, as experienced on the street, remained untouched by the questions forming elsewhere. This contrast is not unusual in complex investigations. The visible world often lags far behind the administrative one. Decisions are not made on instinct or appearance, but on accumulation, on patience, on the willingness to revisit details others might overlook. As weeks passed, the references did not disappear. Instead, they multiplied slightly, each one still small, still explainable, but now harder to ignore entirely. A document here, a record there. Each addition carried the same quiet implication. Something required clarification. Authorities later explained that this phase of work is deliberately slow. Acting too quickly risks error. Acting too slowly risks missing significance. The balance is maintained through review, discussion, and restraint. At no point was the assumption made that wrongdoing had occurred, only that understanding was incomplete. The first tangible shift came not through discovery, but through absence. A routine verification failed to produce an expected confirmation. It was minor, easily correctable, but notable enough to be logged. A single missing piece in an otherwise orderly process. On its own, it meant very little, but placed alongside the existing questions, it carried weight, not as evidence and not as proof, but as a signal, the kind that suggests the need to look again, and this time, a little more closely.
Rather than closing the file, authorities placed it into a category reserved for matters requiring periodic review. This was a routine administrative step, used when details are incomplete rather than concerning. Still, it ensured that any new reference linked to the same names, numbers, or addresses would be flagged automatically. The process was quiet, methodical, and deliberately cautious. As days turned into weeks, those flags appeared more often than expected, not frequently enough to suggest urgency, but consistently enough to suggest structure. Travel records aligned with administrative timestamps in ways that felt coordinated rather than accidental. Addresses in different cities appeared connected through shared contact information. Financial activity, while not unusual in volume, followed timelines that overlapped with known international movements. None of this pointed clearly to wrongdoing. Authorities noted that in a globalized society, people travel, communicate, and relocate regularly. Many perfectly lawful explanations could account for such overlaps. Family connections, business interests, or shared accommodation histories often create similar patterns. The task at this stage was not to assume intent, but to understand context. Individuals connected to the records were introduced into the review carefully. No labels were applied. Files described them only by verifiable facts: age ranges, places of residence, immigration status, and known associations. Language remained neutral throughout. Investigators avoided speculative terms, focusing instead on timelines and documented behavior. One individual, for example, appeared in records from both London and Leicester within a short period. This alone was unremarkable, but when paired with communication logs linking the same person to contacts in Birmingham and Essex, it raised a quiet question. Why did administrative interactions cluster around specific dates? Why did movements align so closely across locations that rarely intersect in routine paperwork? Another file showed repeated references to the same overseas jurisdiction. Belgian authorities had submitted requests connected to individuals whose names overlapped with UK systems. These requests were formal and lawful, part of standard international cooperation. However, the repetition stood out. The same cluster of people appeared in unrelated inquiries, each time from a different angle. At this stage, no single detail justified escalation, but the accumulation made dismissal difficult. Analysts described the situation later as one of persistent ambiguity. Nothing was clearly wrong, yet nothing fully resolved. Each answer generated another question. Authorities responded by widening the scope of review slightly. Without initiating a formal investigation, they compared timelines across departments. Border records were examined alongside residency data. Communication metadata was reviewed in aggregate form, without examining content. The emphasis remained on patterns, not particulars. This broader view revealed subtle consistencies. Movements tended to follow similar sequences. Appearances in official systems occurred in clusters rather than randomly. When one individual interacted with authorities, another connected name often appeared shortly before or after, sometimes in a different city. Again, caution prevailed. Analysts documented alternative explanations for every observation: shared legal representation, community support networks, coincidental scheduling. Each possibility was noted and tested against available data. Some explanations held. Others did not fully account for the regularity observed. What stood out most was timing. Several administrative events aligned with dates linked to international activity already under review by European partners. Not the same events and not the same locations, but the same periods. This overlap was not proof of coordination, but it reduced the likelihood of coincidence. Throughout this process, restraint was maintained. No surveillance was initiated, no interviews conducted. Authorities stated later that the threshold for such steps had not yet been met. Instead, the focus remained on understanding whether the emerging picture justified further attention. Behind the scenes, communication between agencies increased. Information was shared carefully, following legal frameworks designed to protect individual rights. Each exchange was documented, each request justified. Oversight mechanisms ensured that curiosity did not become intrusion. Gradually, the tone of internal discussions shifted. Where earlier notes had asked whether patterns existed, later ones asked whether they mattered. This was a subtle but important change. It marked the transition from observation to consideration. One development in particular prompted pause. A routine data comparison revealed that several individuals connected through UK records were also named in active Belgian court documents. These documents did not allege offenses committed in the UK, but they did reference an organized activity operating across borders. The wording was careful. Allegations were described, not adopted. Authorities treated the information as contextual, not determinative. Still, it introduced a new dimension. The question was no longer limited to domestic administrative irregularities. It now involved international legal processes. At this point, senior officials were briefed, not because action was imminent, but because awareness was necessary. When potential cross-border issues arise, decision-making must be informed at higher levels to ensure consistency and legality. The review continued, now with added perspective. Analysts revisited earlier data with fresh context. Patterns that seemed merely unusual now appeared more coherent, not conclusive but directional. The final factor was absence again. A scheduled administrative interaction did not occur as expected. There was no violation, no breach, simply a deviation from an established pattern. When combined with the existing questions, it suggested anticipation rather than chance. Taken together, these elements led authorities to a measured conclusion. The situation did not yet justify enforcement, but it did require closer attention. What had begun as routine review had reached a point where distance was no longer appropriate. For the first time, the possibility that these overlapping details formed part of a larger, coordinated picture could not be reasonably set aside.
That conclusion did not trigger immediate intervention, but it did widen the frame through which the situation was viewed. What had previously been treated as a collection of local irregularities was now assessed as potentially connected activity across multiple regions. Authorities expanded their administrative review beyond individual addresses or names, comparing data across cities that had, until then, been considered separately. London, Leicester, Birmingham, Essex, and South London were no longer isolated reference points. They became part of a broader geographic picture. This expansion was handled through existing legal channels. No new powers were sought, and no exceptional measures were introduced. Instead, information already lawfully held was examined side by side. Timelines were aligned, records were cross-referenced. Analysts focused on how often the same details appeared in different contexts and whether those appearances followed a discernible pattern. The scope widened further through international cooperation. Belgian authorities, already engaged in related legal proceedings, shared contextual updates within established frameworks. These exchanges were factual and limited, designed to clarify overlap rather than to influence domestic decisions. UK officials noted where names, dates, or locations intersected, and where they did not. This comparative approach produced a clearer sense of scale. Individuals previously seen as loosely connected now appeared as part of a wider network of associations, not a hierarchy and not a defined structure, but a recurring set of relationships that extended beyond any single city. Movements, communications, and administrative interactions seemed to follow a shared rhythm. Importantly, this rhythm was observed without examining content or intent. Authorities relied on aggregated indicators rather than personal detail. The emphasis remained on legality and proportionality. Each step was reviewed to ensure it stayed within regulatory boundaries. As the picture developed, the focus shifted from who to how. Not how actions were carried out, but how systems were being encountered. Analysts noted repeated engagement with specific administrative processes across jurisdictions. These engagements were lawful on their face, yet collectively they suggested coordination. At the same time, alternative explanations continued to be tested. Community networks often span cities and countries. Shared language, family ties, and migration histories can naturally produce similar patterns. Authorities documented these possibilities carefully, ruling out those that did not fit the full set of observations. One administrative development proved particularly informative. A review of international requests revealed that multiple individuals connected through UK records were named in separate Belgian case files, each time linked to facilitation rather than direct participation. The language was cautious, and the allegations were not mirrored domestically, but the repetition was notable. This did not change the legal status of those individuals in the UK. No charges were pending, and no assumptions were made. However, it reinforced the need to understand the broader context in which UK-based activity might sit. To manage this complexity, coordination increased. Regular briefings were established between departments responsible for border oversight, immigration compliance, and international liaison. These meetings were procedural, focused on alignment rather than action. Each department retained its own mandate, but information flowed more freely. The widening scope also revealed gaps. Certain movements could not be fully explained by existing records, not because information was hidden, but because it lay outside the datasets being compared. This prompted requests for clarification through partner agencies, again using routine legal mechanisms. As responses arrived, the geographic picture extended further into continental Europe. References to transit countries appeared, not as destinations, but as points of administrative relevance in foreign proceedings. UK authorities did not investigate these aspects directly, but they noted their relevance to the overall narrative forming. Throughout this phase, patience remained central. Officials were conscious that premature conclusions could compromise both accuracy and fairness. Every new connection was logged, reviewed, and placed alongside existing material. Nothing was elevated without corroboration. Gradually, the situation moved from ambiguous to structured, not resolved, but clearer. The recurring elements were no longer isolated coincidences. They formed a network of associations that crossed local and national boundaries, linked by timing, contact, and repeated administrative presence. The significant shift came when Belgian authorities formally notified UK counterparts that several individuals residing in the UK were subject to active judicial interest abroad. This was not a request for immediate action, but a legal update confirming that the matter had progressed beyond preliminary inquiry in another jurisdiction. With that confirmation, the investigation's direction changed. What had begun as cautious observation now entered a phase of formal consideration, requiring closer coordination and careful preparation for what might follow.
That change in direction brought with it a different kind of pressure, one defined not by urgency, but by responsibility. Once the matter entered a phase of formal consideration, the emphasis shifted to structure. Law enforcement agencies did not move independently. Instead, roles were clarified and oversight strengthened. Senior officers ensured that all activity followed established legal thresholds, aware that cross-border cases require particular care. Every step taken would need to withstand scrutiny, not only in UK courts, but potentially in international proceedings as well. Coordination became more deliberate. The National Crime Agency acted as a central point of contact, liaising with regional police forces and international partners. This did not result in immediate action on the ground. Rather, it created a framework within which information could be assessed consistently. Decisions were no longer made in isolation, but through collective review. Investigative pressure built through documentation. Analysts revisited earlier material with renewed focus, testing assumptions against updated context. Where information had once been logged and set aside, it was now re-examined line by line. Timelines were reconstructed carefully, ensuring that no detail was taken out of sequence. The aim was clarity, not acceleration. Legal advisors played a central role during this phase. Their task was to ensure that investigative curiosity did not overstep lawful boundaries. Requests for information were drafted narrowly. Each was justified by reference to existing material rather than speculation. Where uncertainty existed, restraint was advised. This process was slow by design. Authorities stated later that patience is often the most demanding aspect of complex investigations. Pressure comes not from action, but from waiting while questions remain unanswered. The temptation to draw conclusions must be resisted, particularly when individuals' rights and international obligations are involved. As reviews continued, oversight mechanisms became more visible. Independent checks ensured that data handling complied with regulation. Supervisory officers reviewed progress at set intervals, not to push outcomes, but to confirm proportionality. This ensured that momentum did not replace judgment. Across different regions, local forces were briefed on the evolving context. These briefings were factual and limited.
Officers were instructed to remain observant but not intrusive. No changes were made to routine policing. The focus remained on preparation rather than intervention. Meanwhile, communication with Belgian authorities deepened. Updates were exchanged through formal channels, each side careful to distinguish between established facts and ongoing allegations. The language used was precise, reflecting the seriousness of international cooperation. No assumptions were shared, only verified information. During this phase, a number of anticipated developments did not occur. Individuals continued their daily lives without visible change. Administrative interactions remained lawful and routine. This absence of disruption was itself noted. In investigations, stability can be as informative as movement. Behind the scenes, however, one area of review gained prominence. Analysts compared earlier records with more recent submissions and noticed a subtle inconsistency. A document provided by one agency did not align fully with data held by another. The discrepancy was minor, involving dates rather than substance, but it prompted further checking. This led to a broader audit of information sources. Files were traced back to their origin, ensuring accuracy at each stage of transmission. In most cases, the records matched precisely, but in reviewing correspondence linked to the Belgian proceedings, something unexpected emerged. One individual previously thought to be peripheral appeared in multiple documents under slightly different identifiers, not different names, but variations in recorded details that had prevented earlier alignment. Once corrected, this revealed that the same person had been referenced more frequently than initially understood. This was not evidence of wrongdoing, but it altered the perceived scale of involvement. What had seemed like separate mentions now formed a clearer sequence. The individual's presence across timelines and jurisdictions was more consistent than previously recognized. Authorities treated this discovery with caution. The information was verified independently before being acknowledged internally. Once confirmed, it was shared with legal advisors and partner agencies to ensure a common understanding. The revelation did not lead to immediate action. Instead, it reinforced the need for continued care. It demonstrated how easily complexity can obscure clarity and how essential thorough review is to fair investigation. As this phase concluded, officials recognized that the matter had reached a point where preparation would soon need to give way to decision. The pressure had not come from urgency, but from accumulation, from the steady weight of verified detail now too coherent to ignore.
With the accumulated information fully verified, authorities moved from preparation to formal action. Arrests were conducted across multiple cities, including London, Leicester, Birmingham, Essex, and South London. Each operation was planned within legal frameworks, ensuring that every individual was treated in accordance with the law and that rights were fully respected. Officers involved approached their work with professionalism, conscious that these were not mere statistics, but people with families, livelihoods, and legal protections. The arrests themselves were carried out without incident. There were no confrontations, no chaotic scenes. Each individual was informed of the reason for detention and their rights under UK law. Transportation to holding facilities followed routine procedures, and care was taken to maintain dignity and fairness at every stage. Records indicate that all operations were meticulously documented, reflecting the importance of transparency and accountability. Once in custody, those arrested were presented before magistrates. The courts reviewed the charges, which related to facilitating the movement of individuals across borders without proper authorization. Lawyers were present for each person, ensuring that the legal process was followed meticulously. At no point were assumptions about guilt made public. Reporting and documentation focused entirely on established facts and procedural adherence. Bail considerations, remand decisions, and the scheduling of further hearings were determined by the courts in line with standard practice. The process emphasized accountability rather than spectacle. Authorities later stated that the priority was to uphold the rule of law and to ensure that proceedings were fair and impartial, reflecting the principle that justice is served through process rather than immediate outcomes. Investigators continued to review the broader context as legal proceedings unfolded. International cooperation remained central. Belgian authorities provided relevant documentation confirming that the individuals were linked to ongoing inquiries in their jurisdiction. This cross-border information was shared in accordance with established agreements, allowing the UK courts to consider the full spectrum of context without compromising legal integrity. In addition to the judicial process, administrative measures were adjusted to reflect lessons learned. Certain procedural safeguards were strengthened to ensure that any future similar occurrences would be detected earlier, and records were updated to provide clarity on roles, responsibilities, and oversight. The emphasis throughout remained on preventing procedural errors and maintaining the integrity of enforcement systems. As court proceedings progressed, outcomes began to crystallize. Some individuals faced extended remand periods while their cases were considered, while others were released under strict conditions pending further hearings. Each decision reflected a careful weighing of risk, legal obligation, and fairness. There was no rush. The pace of justice was measured to ensure that every consideration was properly addressed. Beyond the immediate legal outcomes, there were wider ramifications. Authorities noted that the arrests and proceedings served as a reminder that international cooperation is critical in a globalized world. Information sharing, adherence to legal frameworks, and diligent verification of data can prevent potential exploitation without undermining the rights of those involved. The case highlighted how law enforcement, judiciary, and international partners can operate together within defined, lawful boundaries to address complex challenges. Public communications were handled with equal care. Statements issued by the National Crime Agency and local police focused on the procedural and legal aspects of the case. They emphasized the principles of fairness, transparency, and adherence to due process. Media reports were encouraged to maintain neutral and factual reporting, avoiding sensationalist interpretations of events. This approach was intended to inform the public without compromising ongoing proceedings or the reputations of those involved. At the community level, responses were measured. Residents noted the presence of law enforcement, but understood that the interventions were legal and controlled. There was no disruption to daily life beyond the normal routines associated with official visits. Authorities later reflected that maintaining calm in the community was an integral part of their strategy, ensuring that normalcy continued even as complex legal processes unfolded behind the scenes. By the end of this phase, the situation had moved from uncertainty to clarity, though not to finality. Legal processes were ongoing, and further hearings were scheduled. The principal outcome was the establishment of accountability through lawful channels. Individuals were subject to the court's oversight, their rights preserved, and the broader network of information clarified through careful investigation and international collaboration. As investigators and judicial authorities looked back, they recognized that the case exemplified the balance between vigilance and restraint. Action was necessary, but it was measured. Scrutiny was applied, but it was fair. And oversight ensured that every step complied with legal and ethical standards. The resolution phase did not signify an end to the matter in absolute terms, but it demonstrated how complex, cross-border issues can be addressed responsibly. It became clear that the focus of the work was less on dramatic outcomes and more on the enduring principles of law. Ensuring that procedures were followed, rights were respected, and justice could be administered in a transparent and equitable manner was the ultimate measure of success. Reflection on this stage highlighted the careful orchestration of investigation, legal review, and international collaboration that underpinned the accountability observed. The case closed one chapter, but questions remained.
Further proceedings in domestic and international jurisdictions were anticipated, and monitoring continued to ensure compliance with court orders. What had emerged was not a narrative of confrontation or sensationalism, but a demonstration of measured, lawful response to complex administrative and international challenges. The stage was now set for considering the long-term impact and lessons learned, as the investigation transitioned from immediate outcomes to reflection and analysis.
With the immediate legal processes underway, attention gradually turned to the longer-term implications of the case. Communities in London, Leicester, Birmingham, Essex, and South London had observed the careful operations of law enforcement, and while daily life had not been disrupted, the presence of official oversight left a lasting impression. Residents expressed a quiet reassurance that authorities were actively monitoring and addressing complex cross-border issues, even when these did not directly affect their daily routines. At the same time, the case prompted reflection on how communities engage with wider societal challenges and how awareness of procedural safeguards can contribute to a sense of security. For law enforcement and government agencies, the case highlighted areas for improvement in coordination, data management, and international cooperation. Policy reviews were undertaken to ensure that similar matters could be identified and addressed more efficiently in the future. Guidance on information sharing between domestic and foreign authorities was reinforced, clarifying the responsibilities of each party while respecting the legal rights of individuals. These measures aim to streamline oversight without compromising due process, allowing agencies to respond more confidently when patterns of concern emerged across multiple jurisdictions. Training initiatives were also informed by the case. Analysts and operational staff were encouraged to apply the lessons learned regarding the importance of patience, verification, and careful cross-referencing of administrative records. Emphasis was placed on the balance between vigilance and restraint, ensuring that observations lead to understanding rather than premature conclusions. In essence, the case served as a practical example of how complex, multi-jurisdictional matters require thoughtful, law-abiding attention rather than reactive measures. From a public perspective, the case offered an opportunity to improve awareness of international migration issues and the mechanisms in place to regulate them safely. Authorities stated publicly that lawful procedures exist to manage cross-border movement and that irregular activity is monitored through structured, collaborative channels. Educational initiatives, community meetings, and informational campaigns highlighted the importance of understanding legal processes and the role that accurate information plays in maintaining public confidence. The aim was not to alarm, but to inform, reinforcing trust between residents and institutions. The case also raised questions that could not be answered definitively in the short term. For example, the motivations and full networks of individuals involved remained under investigation in international jurisdictions. While arrests and domestic proceedings addressed immediate accountability, further clarity depended on ongoing judicial processes abroad. Authorities approached these gaps with transparency, acknowledging what was known, what remained uncertain, and what could only be resolved through continued legal channels. This responsible communication ensured that public understanding was aligned with verified information, avoiding speculation or misrepresentation. In reflecting on the societal impact, investigators noted subtle but meaningful shifts in operational practice. Agencies became more adept at noticing patterns across administrative systems, integrating domestic and international records more effectively, and ensuring that oversight mechanisms functioned consistently. Lessons about patience, structured review, and procedural integrity became embedded in organizational culture, shaping responses to future investigations of similar scale and complexity. These improvements underscored that true progress in law enforcement is measured not only in arrests or prosecutions, but in strengthened processes, accountability, and public trust. Community-level effects were equally notable. Residents reported increased confidence in knowing that authorities could detect and respond to complex networks without disrupting everyday life.
This reassurance contributed to a calmer environment where vigilance existed without fear. Neighborhoods that had once been unconsciously connected through administrative anomalies now understood that their involvement was indirect and that careful, lawful monitoring had preserved both safety and privacy. The outcome reinforced the principle that justice operates through process and procedure rather than spectacle. As lessons were digested, a broader perspective emerged. The case exemplified how interconnected the modern world is and how domestic authorities operate within an international framework to maintain order and fairness. It demonstrated that law enforcement relies not only on action, but on analysis, verification, and patient coordination. At the same time, it highlighted the importance of maintaining respect for individuals' rights, even when dealing with complex, multinational issues. Accountability, transparency, and proportionate response became the defining themes of the investigation's aftermath. Ultimately, the case closed a chapter in the formal sense, but it remained a reference point for future understanding. It reinforced the importance of calm, methodical investigation, of thorough review before intervention, and of measured communication with both the public and international partners. The significance lay not in dramatic events or sensational discoveries, but in demonstrating that complex networks can be addressed responsibly, lawfully, and with enduring attention to fairness. In the quiet reflection that followed, authorities and communities alike returned to their routines, now informed by the knowledge that vigilance can exist without disruption, and that patterns, however subtle, are observed and interpreted within a framework of integrity. The same streets, the same daily rhythms, the same sense of normalcy prevailed, but beneath them lay the reassurance of careful oversight. And so, as in the beginning, police and communities alike recognized that the unseen work of observation and verification often carries the greatest importance, quietly preserving both order and trust.